in Collinsville, Illinois. There's this German-American guy named Robert Prager, and he gets lynched by a mob in 1918. And his only crime was that he was a socialist. He had a German accent, and he applied to join a local miners' union. Like, that was it. That was enough. They wrapped him in an American flag and marched him through the streets, and they strangled him to death. And the killers were tried. They put him on trial, and then they were acquitted. And the jury said it was done in the name of patriotism. Let that sink in for you. They literally said, it's fine to kill this guy because it was done in the name of patriotism.
What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It's Henry Zamota and Danny Abdel-Jabbar. What's up, man? How are you?
Chilling, man, as per usual. How about yourself?
I'm doing good. I'm doing very good because we have a very interesting topic today. And today's topic, well, let's just pull this back a little bit because I want to tell the story of this very interesting place, this very interesting part of America that tells a really American story.
Super American.
It's the story of melting pots, the story of family pride, the story of how this country was founded, and a story that's somewhat controversial.
Just a little bit.
So, we're talking about in the town of Pickaway County, Ohio. If you go there, you might be surprised to find that there are some landmarks and some street signs. So there is a Hitler Road, a Hitler Park, and then a Hitler Ludwig Cemetery. And maybe the most renowned is Hitler Pond.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have those
so here's
up?
that. Yep, here's that Hitler number 2 road street sign. Here's a guy that we're going to talk about later. Here's Hitler Ludwig graveyard, which, I mean, I've been to concentration camps before. I've seen the famous Arbeit macht frei sign. This kind of looks like that. I'm not gonna lie, but this is not that. This is Hitler Ludwig Cemetery. And then what else we got on this one here? Here's one of the gravestones in that cemetery. George Hitler, good old George over here. He died in 1889. And then if you're curious where Hitler Pond is, here's Hitler Pond. It's a quaint looking little pond here. But just for some context, zooming out here, this is just a little while south of Columbus, Ohio.
So it's funny for obvious reasons. But let's just clarify. So these are not tributes to Adolf Hitler. There's the locals are very adamant about clarifying that.
Mm-hmm.
These are landmarks. They're honoring the Hitler family of Ohio, and I think it's worth going into the Ohio Hitlers. They were American settlers who arrived in the U.S. in the 18th century, long before Adolf Hitler was born, or even before Adolf Hitler's father even adopted the name Hitler.
That's right.
You see, Hitler's father, Alois, he was born Alois Schicklgruber, Schicklgruber.
Alois Schicklgruber, which is just such a silly name, Schicklgruber. Can you imagine if instead we were saying, I'm going to use the time machine to go back in time and kill baby Schicklgruber. It's just such a stupid name. Anyway, Schicklgruber.
Imagine if he stuck with the name Schicklgruber.
Schicklgruber.
Oh, God, man, you're acting like Schicklgruber right now.
You're a Schicklgruber apologist.
You're a Schicklgruber apologist, you son of a bitch.
Mein Kampf, written by Schicklgruber. Adolf Schicklgruber. Oh, man. What a name. It's such an unserious sounding name.
I know. Well, so Hitler's father, he adopted the name Hitler. That was Schicklgruber was his birth name, but he was born out of wedlock. So Hitler's father was illegitimate, so he carried his mother's surname, which was Schicklgruber. Mm-hmm. And Alois, he eventually petitioned to declare his deceased stepfather, last name Heidler, as his biological father. And then the name I'm not sure how it ended up as Hitler, but it was written down as Hitler in the official registry.
Yeah, that's honestly not that big a deal. It's a phonetic variation. So Heidler, Hitler with different spelling. They're all common names in like Lower Austria and Bavaria. It's kind of like my last name. I'm Abdel-Jabbar. I always like to joke, when someone can't pronounce or read my name, I'm like, hey, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar? That's my uncle. It's a joke that I like to say because everyone can say Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, but no one can say Abdel-Jabbar, which is slightly annoying. But both of those last names, even though they're spelled differently, are effectively the same name in Arabic. So they're just phonetic variations of the same name.
Yeah. Well, once legal paternity was recognized, Alois was able to change his name to Alois Hitler. This means, and just going back to the Hitler family, this means that there's no genealogical connection.
Genealogical, yeah.
Genealogical connection between the infamous Hitler and the Ohio Hitler family, despite sharing the same surname. And these were interesting people. So George Hitler, he was the family patriarch, and his descendants were known as respectable members of the community. George Hitler was born in Maryland in 1763. He descended from Germans from the Rhineland who arrived in America in the mid-1700s. And in 1799, he moved his family and his wife, Susanna Hitler, and his 4 little children Hitler,
Little Hitlers.
his little Hitlers, by flatboat down the Ohio River to the fertile Pickaway Plains in what would become Circleville, Ohio. And in 1808, he secured a land patent for 160 acres in Pickaway Township, and then he officially established a homestead. And then there, George Hitler established a very successful grain milling and flour production operation, and he essentially transforms the wilderness into productive farmland. He was the embodiment of the pioneer spirit, all traits that future Hitlers would inherit, meaning his descendants. So George and Susanna Hitler had at least 11 children.
They were getting busy.
The most notable descendants were George Washington Hitler.
George Washington Hitler.
George Washington Hitler, born in 1845, and then he died in 1928.
1928. It's 100 years ago.
And his other famous descendant was Dr. Gay Hitler.
Gay Hitler. Dr. Gay Hitler. Just say that a couple of times out loud. His name was Gay Hitler.
So George Washington Hitler and Dr. Gay Hitler. Dr. Gay Hitler served his community as a dentist and was known to be a very kind and caring professional and maintained a stable practice for over 2 decades. So for generations, the Hitlers, they were community leaders. They helped found civic institutions. They helped establish schools. They established churches. The Martha Hitler Park, donated by his granddaughter Martha Hitler, still remains a public recreation area. We can pull that up. Martha Hitler Park.
Hitler Park.
Nice. It looks like a nice park. Green grass.
Yeah, it's a park.
And then the family name was honored through places named Hitler Road, Hitler Road number 1,
and number
Hitler
2.
Road number 2, Hitler or Huber Hitler Road, and of course Hitler Pond and Hitler Park and Hitler Cemetery. Now, believe it or not, there are what we call snowflakes who are offended by this great American family.
Who have nothing to do with Adolf Hitler, just to be
abundantly
clear.
Nothing to do with Adolf Hitler or the Nazis. So
Not
after
at all.
Charlottesville, after the Charlottesville rally, some libtards, some fucking libtards, they launched a petition to remove the Hitler name from local signs. And this petition argues that the name could feel threatening or embolden hate groups.
Let's take a look at that. Let's see how many. Only 137 signatures. So,
Let's read this.
Whatever.
So currently there is a body of water in Ohio called Hitler Pond. This name evokes images of death, genocide, World War II atrocities, destruction, and feelings of heartache, anger, fear, and other negative emotions. While it is always important to remember the past in our history so we don't repeat mistakes, this is not the way to go about it, and we must change this name in honor of Gish, Misha Collins, and my team. And okay, I don't need to read that. So yeah, what do you think? Do you think that they should change the name? They should change Hitler Pond's name?
I mean, no. This is the stupidest shit I've ever heard of. Okay, so like you brought up the like the removal of statues and stuff like that, and I think being a bit more left leaning than you are, there are some of these statues that I think you can make a good case for removal because we're basically, in my opinion, glorifying the acts of people who sought to fight against our country and were seditious against our country. And I don't necessarily believe, that we should be glorifying them in a public context. However, the Hitlers of Ohio didn't do shit wrong. They didn't do anything except for have the last name Hitler. And I think this is the weakest, stupidest, like, I think there's a reason why they only got 137 signatures is what I'm trying to get at. How do you feel about it?
Would you change your name if it was Danny Bin Laden instead of Danny Abdel-Jabbar?
Like if my name was Danny Bin Laden? I don't know, man. I think I already have had quite an interesting life. I was alive and of age during the 9/11 attacks, and I grew up in the wake of that. And just having a last name like Abdel-Jabbar and being Arabic by itself was a little bit tough. I had my share of racism and extra special screenings in airports and things like that. But man, if my name was Bin Laden, my last name was Bin Laden, I don't know. I think it would be exponentially harder than having a last name of Abdel-Jabbar. I don't know. Maybe.
Danny Bin Laden.
Danny Bin Laden. Rolls off the tongue, right?
Hey, I mean, the Bin Ladens
like,
were a very, very wealthy family in Saudi Arabia. I mean, they basically built that country.
Yeah.
And there's still plenty of Bin Ladens around.
That's true. If I was a Bin Laden, would that also mean that I'm part of that Bin Laden family that's very wealthy? Because if that was the case,
not necessarily, but I mean, Osama bin Laden had like 42 brothers and sisters. So
yeah, that's right.
But yeah, so to go back, the Hitler Road #1, #2, Hitler Pond, they're all still officially named after the family. The the county declined to rename these roads and landmarks, citing that there was historical significance and that the original Hitler family should be honored.
Yeah.
But, can you imagine if you're trying to spell out your, it's like, hey, where do you live? I live on Hitler Road.
Hitler Road.
Like Adolf Hitler. Well, to spell it out for you, it's Hitler. Hitler Road.
What other names would be unfortunate if we had them? So you pointed out, like, if I was Danny Bin Laden, what other name, like, just has such a negative connotation associated with it now that, like...
man, Epstein is a pretty bad one.
Oh, yeah. But there's a lot of Epsteins, though.
Yeah.
Like a lot of them. And I bet that there's quite a few Jeffrey Epsteins that still exist. I bet there's...
I used to work for a guy named Jeffrey Epstein.
Really?
Not the Jeffrey Epstein, but...
like the Jeffrey Epstein in New York City? Wow.
Yeah, it sucked. I'm sure it sucks now.
Sucks for him. Yeah.
Let's see, other ones.
What else would be like a terrible name,
Stalin?
Yeah.
But
I don't think many people care.
Yeah,
Mao,
most people
maybe?
wouldn't care.
Yeah.
Mao? Someone would just think that's like a Chinese name. No one would care.
Yeah. There's just like a handful of those names that like are verboten forever. Hitler is apparently one of them.
Well, in 100 years, it probably won't be like that.
Maybe. We'll see.
All right. So should we make a mental note right now that this, should we
it's
make
fine.
a verbal? Okay. So why don't we,
we could like segue from here because I think this is, an interesting way to start the show, but like the purpose of the show is to talk about like German American identity. So like the Hitlers, there's many German immigrants throughout American history, and the first major wave had arrived in the late 1600s and 1700s. A lot of them came from the Palatinate region, the Rhineland, and other parts of southwest Germany, and it was people like the Mennonites who founded Germantown near Philadelphia, or which is the first lasting German American town. And throughout the 1700s, Pennsylvania drew more and more Germans, including Lutherans and Reformed Christians and Amish people and Moravians, a bunch of different ethnic groups and ideologies and cultures, but all German. And by 1790, Germans made up about 38%, almost 40% of Pennsylvania's population. So that was at the time over 150,000 people, and they were concentrated in areas like Lancaster, Berks and York counties. I have family that live out there, and the area is really cool. I go there quite a lot. But these settlers are called, you might recognize the name, the Pennsylvania Dutch. They're not Dutch as in the language, but it's coming from the word Deutsch, which is the language of German that was preserved through their customs for generations.
Well, there were other communities too. So up in the Hudson Valley,
Mm-hmm.
there were a lot of Germans. In the Carolinas, there were a lot of Germans. In Georgia, there's a lot up in New Hampshire and Vermont area too. If you go up to New Hampshire, you'll find like some old school German towns, like still with like the old German architecture.
South Texas has a lot too. I don't know if we're going to talk about Texas, the immigration patterns out west, but there's a lot in South Texas.
They were everywhere. Germans literally went everywhere from the east to South America to obviously all over the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
German identity really was baked into the American DNA. And the reason why there were so many Germans leaving is because in the 1700s, a lot of parts of Germany were still, basket cases. There were some areas that never really recovered from the 30-year war.
Mm-hmm.
And, the point being, but by the time of U.S. independence, Germans were already a major part of American society.
Right.
However, the big wave of German immigration, that took place in the 1800s. So nearly 6 million arrived between 1820 and World War I. They became the largest immigrant group in the U.S. I think they went back and forth between the Irish, of who was a larger group.
Yeah.
I don't have the exact statistics, but it was the Germans
Pretty
and
close.
the Irish.
Mm-hmm.
And, Germany in the 19th century was a pretty wild place. There was lots of political repression in rural areas. Traditional industries like weaving, they were collapsing under the pressures of the Industrial Revolution. And then there were also a lot of crop failures too.
Yeah. Yeah. And adding to what you're saying, there's a lot of political oppression. For example, the 48ers were these political refugees from the German-speaking European countries who, fled to, after the failures of the 1848 revolutions. And these uprisings aimed to basically create, liberal reforms, but they were crushed by these conservative monarchies. And when their revolutions failed, thousands of those people who took part in those revolutions, they basically escaped arrest or execution by just going abroad, right? And many of them were radicals for the time, right? They gravitated towards Lincoln's Republican Party at the time in the 1850s, and they really helped shape its ideology, and they settled predominantly in the American Midwest and in the Southwest too. And I've actually been meaning to ask you, I know that you're working on a show about like how Catholic immigrants are seen back in these days. Do you know more about like the German Catholics? Because I know that was a pretty big group as well. I know they're pretty different from the 48ers though, right?
Yeah. So, German Catholics were different. You lived in Germany for a long time, right? You probably know the differences between German Catholics and Protestants. German Catholics are a lot more conservative.
Mm-hmm.
They looked at the 48ers as like these godless revolutionaries.
Yeah.
because these 48ers, like you said, a lot of them were part of the German Revolution, and like they were essentially political refugees that were coming
Yeah.
to the U.S. And that's
They
why
were the
they
losers at
gravitated.
the time. Literal
Yeah,
losers, yeah.
and that's why they gravitated to the Republican Party, because that represented a lot of kind of the ideals that they believed in at the time. But
Hmm.
yeah, German Catholics were always very skeptical about these nationalist movements, because there was for many centuries these huge sectarian divides,
Hmm.
and they thought that these nationalist movements were going to be tools for Protestant hegemony. Because Catholics in German lands, a lot of them were peasant farmers, and for the most part, they were poorer than German Protestants. Obviously, like, it's different all over Europe. In France, it was the opposite. Catholics filled the noble class. In Poland, obviously, Catholics filled the noble class. But
Right.
German Catholics in southern and western Germany were often hit a lot harder by the food famines. And, many were also very hostile towards the Prussians, who were becoming the dominant, political entity at the time. So you had a lot of them move to America. So when both groups emigrated to the United States, Catholic Germans and Protestant Germans, they rarely mixed. In fact, they're, if you look at like Catholic German newspapers, they would, have these warnings about the influence of godless radicals in the German American community. They
Yeah.
were
I
talking
mean, I
about the
guess,
48ers.
yeah. I mean, I guess they brought their like old age sectarian tensions from the old
Yeah,
country to like the new world, like they brought it with them.
yeah, that's exactly what it was. But to some degree, the U.S. already sort of had that. Of course, not as bad as it was in all of Europe, but there was a sectarian divide in the U.S. It wasn't as pronounced at that time as it became later in the
Hmm.
later 18th century, when you had more and more Catholics being, immigrating to the country. But obviously, it was like the United States was a Protestant nation. It was not, Catholics were a big minority.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I mean, German Catholics, known for being a lot more conservative, they did not index with these like national Republican movements. I mean, even Hitler, despite being baptized Catholic, I'm talking about the real Adolf Hitler,
Adolf Hitler, right?
not the Ohio Hitlers. Um,
Schickelgruber.
yeah, that was a demographic he struggled to connect with
Yeah.
until the end of his life.
Hmm. But I mean, to pull this back, like at this point, we had Germans everywhere, right? And by 1900, cities like Milwaukee, Cincinnati, and St. Louis were well over 40% German American, and all these cities had German language schools, churches, clubs, newspapers. He earned the nickname the German Athens, which is really interesting. It's kind of funny because, like, these German immigrants actually brought the teachings of Marx with them to these places that they settled in, and the city actually elected several socialist mayors. But you also had Germans forming rural German belts in places like Texas, like which I mentioned before. I one really cute town in the south of Texas, not far from San Antonio, that I love going to. It's called they pronounce it in Texas as Green, Texas, but it's literally spelled Grün, just like the color green in German. And it's the sleepiest, cutest little town. And I have a lot of fun going out there. And like all around it, there's like it's like this huge uh, um, uh, 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 water park called Schlitterbahn in New Braunfels, which is,
Schlitterbahn. I've heard of that.
yeah, it's super awesome, right? And I like going to they do like Wurst Fest out there in New Braunfels. So it's like a little sausage fest, quite literally, in German. Anyway, I digress. This is just my personal experiences. I really like it, but
Yeah,
yeah.
I mean, so they were everywhere. They were also in the Northeast.
Hmm.
New York City had a very large German community,
Hmm.
probably the largest outside of Europe. The Upper East Side, where I used to live, that used to be like Germantown in the city.
Yeah.
They had this old in the Upper East Side on 86th Street and Second Avenue.
Hmm.
There's this German restaurant that's like 100 years old.
Yeah, we've been there a
Um,
couple times for your birthday, right?
yeah, Heidelberg.
Mm-hmm.
And the lady who owned, I don't know if she's still alive. I haven't been there in 5 or 6 years, but it was like a 90-year-old German woman who owned it.
Yeah.
She inherited it from her family, and then they inherited it from there. I mean, it was just
Yeah.
restaurant was passed down for generations. It was like a real German restaurant. I mean, that place was
Mm-hmm.
awesome. But it was funny. I was someone was telling me that they pointed out this building to me, and they're like, "Hey, at one point this was a German town, and there was when Hitler was elected, there were swastikas like draped on that building."
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, "Oh, really? Like, I didn't know that." But
Mm-hmm.
it was they were sympathetic to the political movements back home. They may have
Yeah.
been more recent German immigrants, but I digress. It wasn't just New York though. So Baltimore, Buffalo, Cleveland, all these cities had big like they had German quarters.
Mm-hmm.
So they German quarters mean they had their own little communities. They may have not been as well as integrated as other as the Anglo Americans,
Mm-hmm.
but by 1910, German Americans make up about 10% of the total U.S. population, and the estimate is that by then, 1 in 4 Americans had at least one German-born parent or grandparent.
That's crazy.
So, I mean, today about 44 million Americans, so that's around 13% of the population probably have German roots.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And Germans were seen as reliable settlers. I mean, a lot of them were educated. They were skilled. They were skilled farmers. They specialized in crafts. They were, for the most part, a lot of the Germans that settled here were nonviolent. So like your Dutch and your Quakers and stuff. So they were pretty easy to absorb into the country. There were nativist movements back in the day. Benjamin Franklin, I know when he first started seeing German immigration, he had said that they would never assimilate. He said something along the lines that they would Germanize us instead of us Anglifying them.
Yeah.
But still,
Yeah.
most Germans were viewed as quick to assimilate by their second or third generation. And by the early 20th century, most German American households, they spoke English at home.
Mm-hmm.
So you still had these like German communities that had their newspaper, and maybe some communities, they spoke English in a German accent, but for the most part, they were seen as like preferable. They prefer, at that time in the United States, they preferred Germans much more over pretty much every other migrant group that was coming into the
Right.
country, being
Mm-hmm.
Irish, Italians, Slavics, Jews.
Italians. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I
Not to
mean,
mention that a lot served in the military. Like a lot
yeah.
of Germans fought for the Union during the Civil War.
Well, that's mostly because they live primarily up north, but still, yeah, you're right. There was a pretty big German contingent in the Union Army. So
Have you ever heard the argument that the Union was using German mercenaries during the Civil War?
I have, but I always thought that was like a propaganda that was like made up by the South. Like, how true is that?
Well, it was used as propaganda, but you can definitely understand the perspective of the Confederates. I mean, imagine being a Confederate soldier and you're facing off against these regiments where no one speaks English, and they're
Yeah.
wearing these like with these weird uniforms, and
Hmm.
you find out they were offered these huge cash bounties just to fight. They thought that they were being invaded by hired foreigners, not Americans,
Hmm.
because you had nearly 200,000 German-born soldiers fighting for the Union, and that
Right.
was more than any other immigrant group.
Hmm.
And entire units were made up of Germans, with German officers. They were speaking German. They were flying German flags. And in places like New York and even Western Virginia, they were forming all German regiments.
Yeah. I mean, so we're not talking about like Americans with German descent. We're just talking about like German immigrants to America, right?
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about both, but the Germans that I'm referring to, these weren't second or third generation. They were They were essentially
Fresh off the
straight off
boat.
the boat. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And some had just arrived a year or two earlier. And states like Massachusetts even imported men from Germany to fill their regiments.
Mm.
So when Southerners called the mercenaries, they weren't entirely pulling it out of thin air. These were literal foreigners getting paid to fight.
Yeah. Okay. That's fair. But like, to be clear, we're not talking about like mercenary armies, right? Like not like the German Hessians as an example, who have like a bad name and a bad rap for American history, right?
No, I mean, this wasn't like the British hiring Hessians in the Revolutionary War.
Mm-hmm.
These guys were not professional soldiers for hire, showing up in like a full Prussian kit. They
That'd be
were
cool though.
they were migrants or refugees. Most of them were completely broke.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have a pot to piss in, and they fled Europe. And when they got to the United States, they were crammed into tenements, and they barely had enough to survive. So the Union started waving around these big enlistment bounties. This money was like life-changing for them because
Mm-hmm.
under the July 1964 draft call, some districts were offering over $1,000 per man. That's like
Mm.
20 grand today.
That's crazy.
So,
1864, by the way. You said 1964.
18,
But even still, $1,000 back then, Jesus. You're
yeah,
right. That's a lot of money.
That's a lot of money. So like even small towns during the Civil War were in these bidding wars. So like Rhode Island, they offered like $350 for one of these bounties, and that doesn't include state and federal pay. So
Right. So
you
you got
have these like
$350
major,
plus all the extra bonuses, right?
yeah, all the other benefits from the military,
Mm-hmm.
because so like the major cities started pouring money in this. So Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, they were all pouring money into this program because you have to remember that the draft was extremely unpopular in northern states. After the Enrollment Act in 1863, there were massive riots. We just spoke about this, I think, in our
Yeah.
last episode.
Yeah, we did.
Or was it last episode or a couple episodes ago?
Yeah, not too long ago.
Over 100 people died in those riots.
Mm-hmm.
So what the federal government did was that they assigned quotas to each congressional district based on the on their population and I think like enlistment numbers or previous enlistment numbers. So if a district met its quota through volunteers, it didn't have to hold a draft.
Yeah. So basically, like threw money at the problem to avoid it. That's what they did. Just throw money at it.
Yeah. So city governments, counties, and even like private citizens created these bounty funds to entice men to volunteer before a draft was necessary.
Mm-hmm.
In richer towns, they recruited from other areas. And in some cases, like in Boston, they imported immigrants from abroad. That number is really not that high. It's like 700 people or 700, 900, I think. Maybe someone can correct me in the comment section. I'm sure they would love to. But
Yeah.
I don't think the actual people that they recruited from Germany itself, that was so big, but they still did do that. So, essentially that meant that they were poaching either the poor or foreign-born men from elsewhere to avoid having their own citizens drafted.
Yeah, but I mean, I feel like the way some people are spinning this, or like people in the South were spinning this, is that the Union was using like Colombian mercs or like the Golden Army, to go fight the South. So it wasn't exactly like that.
Yeah, that's where the line gets blurry. So like, no, like they were not contract soldiers hired from foreign governments, or they weren't these
Right.
like private armies like Blackwater.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't signing the Union wasn't signing deals with like these military contractors.
Yeah.
They weren't signing deals with Prussia or Austria to send troops. So no, they were not mercenaries in a legal sense, but in the eyes of the South, and I mean, even some Northerners, it felt that way. And you're right to point out that the Confederates leaned hard into this narrative because why wouldn't they?
Yeah.
They use it in the propaganda to paint the Union as morally bankrupt. too weak to defend itself without hiring foreigners. So
Mm-hmm.
they'd say things like, the North doesn't have the courage to fight its own wars, or, they're paying Germans, and because they did this with Irishmen too,
Mm-hmm.
to do their killing, and it also played into their whole worldview that the South was fighting for their honor, tradition, and American soil, while the Union was just throwing money at immigrants who didn't speak English and didn't really care about the country. I mean, many of Sherman's soldiers came from Midwestern states where German immigration had exploded in the 1850s.
Yeah.
So as a result, they participated in the total war strategy against the South. So just
Mm-hmm.
like imagine having your farm burned down by some German guy who barely spoke English.
Yeah, I mean, I guess a lot of people in Europe in the 1940s could have imagined something
Yeah,
like that, but
I guess a lot of people in the 1940s could imagine that.
yeah. All right, I think we're getting a little bit off topic here. I need to look more into this because I want to know if if you're full of shit or not. But let's move to World War One. So after the Civil War, Germans are seen as loyal to America, right? But a lot of this changes in the early 20th century during the years of World War One. After the U.S. entered the war, German Americans were under suspicion, and there was the expectation to basically publicly prove their patriotism. This kind of led to these so-called loyalty tests, and I just want to talk a little bit about them because I find them really interesting. Tell me about these loyalty tests.
Yeah, I mean, so a loyalty test, it wasn't like a written exam or anything like that. It was more so like a social expectation. After the U.S. entered the war in 1917, German Americans were viewed with suspicion. People thought that they might be secretly loyal to the Kaiser instead of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So these tests, they come in a bunch of forms, and you might be expected to buy Liberty bonds. If you didn't, people would say you were pro-German. Or, there would be an expectation that you would publicly denounce Germany, even if your parents were from there. You wouldn't be speaking German in public or at church. Some towns even banned it in schools.
Yeah.
And then a lot of German families, they changed their names to sound more Anglo. So like a Schmidt would turn into a Smith.
Or a Schicklgruber will turn into a Hitler. I'm kidding.
Yeah.
I'm joking.
But I mean, a lot of families also sent their kids to go fight in the war too, because
So they'd be
basically,
like, we're totally patriotic. Look, I sent my kid to the war. Yeah, it's fucked up.
well, basically, if you were German American, you had to overperform in your Americanness to avoid harassment.
Honestly, I'm not going to try and go down this rabbit hole here, but I feel like that kind of happens right now with certain ethnic groups. Feeling like they have something to prove to the wider majority here in the United States. But I digress. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. Maybe another time. There's some really messed up things that went down though. Like this wasn't just social pressure. It got pretty ugly. I think. For example, in Collinsville, Illinois, there's this German American guy named Robert Prager, and he gets lynched by a mob in 1918. And his only crime was that he was a socialist. He had a German accent, and he applied to join a local miners' union. Like, that was it. That was enough. They wrapped him in an American flag and marched him through the streets, and they strangled him to death. And the killers were tried. They put him on trial, and then they were acquitted. And the jury said it was done in the name of patriotism. Let that sink in for you. They literally said, it's fine to kill this guy, because it was done in the name of patriotism. Failure of the justice system, in my opinion. But, then you had all these towns that were renaming everything, right? Sauerkraut became Liberty Cabbage. Side note, do you remember during the 9/11 saga, like early time after, there was like this movement of people trying to rename French fries to freedom fries because the French weren't hard enough on the word terror. Do you remember that shit?
Yeah, I do. Freedom fries.
Freedom fries. A couple of other stupid ones. So we have sauerkraut becoming Liberty Cabbage. We have Dachshunds, the dog breed, they were calling them liberty pups, and German language newspapers were just basically shut down, or they were burned down in some cases. In Iowa, the use of like foreign languages in public, including in church and later on over the phone, were looked down upon. Like imagine not being able to pray in the language that is like your primary language, like your mother tongue. It's pretty wild, right? It's crossing into some First Amendment, violations there for sure. Um, Schools start dropping German classes. German music was banned. Beethoven got canceled. I'm not even kidding. Like they canceled Beethoven. And then you get like groups like the American Protective League, who was a private citizens group who basically were deputized to spy on their neighbors, open up their mail and like root out like what they considered as disloyalty wherever they found it or can perceive it. It's basically a full-on cultural purge, And even the people who had been in America for generations, who had fought in the Civil War, who had been considering themselves 100% American, suddenly had to prove that they weren't like the enemy. And that's how fast the tide turns, and there used to be these German towns in America, and they were erased, gone.
Yeah, you don't really see them anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I will add that also German immigration stopped to a large degree after like 1890 something,
Yeah.
because that's when Germany started like providing a lot of its social welfare programs. So
Yeah.
people were like, yeah, we're probably going to stay here. We get like a pension here and all of that. So
Mm-hmm.
the
We can still speak German here too.
yeah, so immigration largely stopped right in the late 19th century. However, I mean, there are still German-born people. I mean, we're talking about people who may have come to America when they were 6.
Mm-hmm.
They're ready to fight in the war when they're 20 or 21 when the
Mm-hmm.
war starts. But yeah, just going back to that, this crazy effort to erase German culture, because this is where it really where you see the death of it.
Mm-hmm.
This country was in like a straight up state of mania. I mean, like going through people's mail. But you had these deputized people to go through people's mail and be like, "Oh, we'll see if he's writing a letter to the to Mexico or something to
Yeah. Right.
instigate a fight." Um, that's some wild stuff. And what's really wild about it is that the United States, or even Anglo-American, didn't have some ancient blood feud with Germany. Most of them thought that they were the same peoples. Most of the Protestant elite at this time, they considered themselves Germanic people. I mean, who was Britain invaded by? Who were they dominated by? The Anglo-Saxons, who were
Right.
a Germanic tribe, or they were Germanic peoples.
Mm-hmm.
I'm no expert on that, the British invasion cycles in the Middle Ages, but I mean that they saw themselves as having this shared ancestry. So it's really strange that this feud that the United States, turned so harshly, because there weren't centuries of war or inherent ethnic hatred. I bet most Americans at that point of time would not even really be able to point out Germany in a map
Probably
before
not.
1914.
Yeah.
Just like how most Americans now probably can't point out Iran in a map.
Probably not.
But once the U.S. entered the war, the government and the media were able to essentially manufacture an enemy. And the Wilson administration, they create the Committee of Public Information, which was a propaganda office. If you couldn't tell by the name,
Right.
the Committee of Public Information. I mean, that's the most propaganda
Yeah.
sounding office I've ever heard of.
Yeah. Right. Let me see if I can pull up some pictures. But go ahead, keep talking.
So the propaganda that they put out, I'm sure everyone has seen it. Everyone has seen the World War I propaganda from both the United States and from London. Let's actually go through some of it because I think it'd be
funny.
interesting for people to see.
All right, yeah, let me bring this up here. So I think the most famous one is this one, like the King Kong looking one. It's like destroy this mad brute, enlist in the U.S. Army, right? And it's a German monkey looking dude. For those who aren't watching this, and he's wearing a German army helmet. He's got the stupid German, mustache thing going on. He's got a big club, and on the club is the German word Kultur, which is bloodied, as is his fists. And the important part of this is he's seems to have abducted a bliss white woman, who I'm presuming is supposed to be representative of, an American, delightful woman or something like that.
Got
So
himself a
this
white
is
woman.
he got himself a white one. Very interesting. Funny picture. What else do we got? Let's see. This one says, "Your money brings the book when we need when we want it." What is this? From the American Library Association? This one's stupid. Let's look for another one.
Type in anti-German propaganda World War One.
This one looks pretty interesting. Let's see what this is all about. All right, this is a one-pager. British Empire Union, once a German, always a German. And it's like a whole ass comic book. It's like on this frame on the top left, is he bayoneting a baby?
He's bayoneting a baby.
Holy shit. All right, what else do they got? Okay, German's got a guy tied up on a stake here or something. He's got a stupid looking grin on his face.
This one guy, there's a woman cowering in fear in the corner.
Yeah, he's probably
the implication is that she is
she does not consent.
She does not consent to what's going to happen next.
No.
And then you have this
what's this weird looking? Okay, so this is like supposed to be a mirror image, right? So on the left-hand side, we got this like evil German guy. I don't know what the hell this is.
A grenade
maybe. Grenade, and then a bloody knife, and it looks like he killed somebody in the background, and he's walking. And in the same pose, now he's like this nice-looking German, business guy, and he's carrying a briefcase full of samples with a sticker of Berlin on it, and I guess it's trying to evoke and say, like, these two people are the same person, And then they're like, remember, every German employed means a British worker idle. Every German article sold means a British article unsold. British Empire Union. Okay, so this is obviously British propaganda against the Germans, but
it's
still
the same thing because
same
the British propaganda was going to the United States.
Right, exactly. Here's another one for victory bonds. 4 reasons for buying victory bonds. That's pretty funny.
And then zoom in the face of the German soldier. It's like a zombified. It's like straight out of night.
Let's see. Which one? This one?
The German soldier. Like what? Oh, it's a mustache.
Let's see.
I thought it was
I
like
didn't know what was going on with his mouth either. Yeah, it was wild.
Yeah, I thought it was like some melted. I thought his face was melting, honestly.
Just really shitty picture, that's all. What else they got? Let's see. Here's another one. This one, crazy. This one appears to be French. Where was that one?
Oh, that's a good one right there.
This one's bad. Actually pretty bad. I'm not going to lie. It's
a metal cover.
It's pretty metal. Okay, so it's like a gorilla wearing a German army hat, and both of his arms are totally bloody, and it's clasping onto and dripping blood onto the earth, primarily dripping blood onto the European continent, and big question mark. This is in Australia, World War I poster. What else do we got here? This is a good article, historyhit.com. Good shit. What do you got? Oh yeah, this is the one I was looking for. The French one. It's just like a German army guy, but it looks like a Yeti, basically. The way that they portray the Germans in these is just like the dehumanizing, right? Like that's 100% what they're trying to do here. And honestly, what they get away with.
From my perception, I know this might sound cynical, is that we all accept that World War I was a banking war at its core.
Mm-hmm.
No one seriously disputes that massive financial interests had their hands all over it.
Yeah.
J.P. Morgan was funding the British and the French long before the U.S. ever declared war.
Right.
And American banks were deep in debt. They were deep in Entente debt. And a German victory would have meant massive defaults. So
Mhm.
from that angle, Wall Street had every reason to push the U.S. into the fight. Essentially, J.P. Morgan got on the phone with Wilson and said, "You better fucking get into this war."
Yeah.
But the thing about Wilson is that I don't know. I used to, I was a kind of a more hardcore libertarian at one time, and you're kind of taught in libertarian indoctrination that Wilson is the most evil president in U.S. history.
Hmm.
I mean, I don't think that Wilson was a good president by any means, and I think he made a lot of bad mistakes. I don't see him the same way I used to, though. I kind of look at him as so he was a university professor. He was a teacher.
Mhm.
He wasn't a banker. He wasn't a general. He wasn't like some diplomat. He was an academic who spent most of his life at Princeton. Who, he was absorbed in abstractions like democracy and moral progress.
Right.
He had no background in matters of war and peace. So when the war came, what I think is that he probably was told that this was going to be a short war and that it was going to be redemptive, and it was going to be a noble American mission to save civilization.
Mhm.
But he was completely out of his depth.
Yeah.
He was surrounded by people who were very good at using his idealism to their own ends.
Right.
If you just like look at his administration, like Colonel Edward House, who never held office and wasn't actually a colonel, he basically functioned as Wilson's primary foreign policy liaison. He was extremely pro-British, and he likely saw the war as this kind of racial civilizational showdown between the Anglo world and the German militarism. And I wonder if a lot of elites saw World War One this way. I mean, just based off the common sentiment, I don't think that was like a super common view around the public, but around elite circles, especially the ones who are close to the British, I think a lot of them thought that way.
Mm-hmm.
That it was
I mean,
like kind of like a war between like the good dramatic people and the bad dramatic people, who
yeah.
the bad dramatic people having lost their way, and now it was up to the good dramatic people to essentially correct to correct those mistakes.
Yeah. I mean, look, I kind of hinted at this before, but unfortunately, like whenever you have kind of an ethnic group that, exists within a larger majority, that's got its own quasi or parallel society, with their own language or their own newspapers, their own schools, churches, things like that, that's always going to breed a certain amount of mistrust, I think, for the larger group. And even if that group's been loyal, to the country for generations, people start asking, who are they loyal to? Are they fully American? And, in the distinction that we're talking about right now, that dynamic was already at play with the German Americans, before the war even started. And at one point they were admired, but they were also seen as a bit separate from or apart from society. And the war just looked a little bit, it just turned a little bit of suspicion into like a whole lot of paranoia. And then, came the things like the Zimmerman telegram, which is Germany was offering Mexico like an alliance against the United States. And that changed everything, right? Because you have to remember the US and Mexico had basically been at war, not long before that part, right? And the border situation was a mess, honestly, still kind of a mess right now. But when, the public hears that Germany, wants to arm Mexico and help them take back the American Southwest, suddenly this isn't just like a European conflict. This is a direct threat to American soil. Or at least that's how they framed it. And then you imagine you're a Midwesterner in 1917. You've got German-speaking neighbors down the street. They read German newspapers. They sing German songs. Maybe they didn't buy a Liberty Bond. I don't know. And then you hear that Germany's trying to incite Mexico against the U.S. And then you're like, what the fuck? Fuck these Germans? That's the feeling that it incites. And that's how you get the idea of a fifth column in it. And honestly, it doesn't matter if it's true. Because the function of the establishment of this fifth column idea is enough to severely, impact the group who's unfortunate enough to be labeled as the fifth column. And, I'll let you infer how what I might mean for the contemporary argument in the United States, but
So,
kind of
so
reads it the same way.
Theodore Roosevelt called it hyphenated Americanism.
Yeah.
So Americans who identified with both their ancestral heritage and their American nationality. So essentially
Hmm.
dual loyalties. And I mean, you can understand it in the case of Germany or Germans
Yeah.
because German communities could be clannish. They could be, they could be very absorbed into their own communities.
For sure.
So
Which, I mean, that kind of takes me to the point. Like, a lot of these German Americans did to prove their loyalty, and a lot of them changed their names to sound more Anglo. Like, you mentioned one, Schmidt becoming Smith, Mueller becoming Miller, Schneider becoming Snyder, and so on and so forth. And ethnic Germans were end up being the largest American ethnic group to serve in the war. Which is fascinating just by itself, right? This is a whole group of people that we're demonizing with propaganda, but they end up being the largest contingent that serves in the war. So ironically, they end up fighting for America in World War I, and they were also the most vilified. A little bit
well,
of a chicken and the egg. They
it's
end up serving the
it's
most because they were the most vilified. I
so
don't know.
what's really interesting about this, and this brings me to a segue. One could argue that Hitler's encounters with American German soldiers during World War I shaped his worldview, and it's actually what made him start thinking seriously about politics.
Mm.
So I read Brendan Sims. Brendan Sims, he came out with a Hitler biography maybe 5 or 6 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
It's called Hitler: A Global Biography, and I think it's my favorite biography on Hitler. It's really, really, really good. He touches on this topic a lot. Essentially, he makes the case that Hitler, prior to World War I, he was largely apolitical. Like, prior to those encounters during the war, the first major political statement that he had ever made was choosing to fight for the German Empire rather than the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Because when he was younger, he referred to himself as a Bavarian, and he
Mm-hmm.
always aligned more with Germany than the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But to pull this back a bit, before German troops were even engaging with American troops, they were already fighting, what you would call, in not politically correct terms now, the colored world. They were fighting black soldiers and Indian soldiers from the British and French Empire,
Mm-hmm.
leading to a sense that the entire world was out to conquer them. So when they finally engaged German American troops in combat, many who spoke German as a first language, in their view, even their own kin had joined a global crusade against them. And this deeply impacted Hitler. And
Mm-hmm.
I brought up some quotes from the Sims book. On July 17th, 1918, the brigade adjutant Fritz Weidmann wrote that Private First Class Hitler dropped off 2 American prisoners. Who these men were and what Hitler made of the incident at the time are not recorded. We do know, however, how he later interpreted what became a seminal moment in his life and thus in the history of the 20th century. Hitler was convinced that these doughboys were the descendants of German immigrants lost to the fatherland for lack of living space to feed them, who had returned as avengers in the ranks of an unstoppable enemy army. In subsequent speeches, he repeatedly came back to the moment in the midsummer of 1918 when the first American soldiers appeared on the battlefields of France, well-grown men of our own blood whom he had deported for centuries, who were now ready to grind the motherland the motherland itself into the mud. And he adds, this is what Brendan Sims adds, this, then, is where it all began. The preoccupation with Germany's demographic weakness, for which Lebensraum in the East was ultimately to become the only remedy. The respect for and fear of the Anglo-Saxon powers with their apparently infinite spatial, demographic, natural, and economic resources, and the determination to avoid another racial civil war between Anglo-Saxon and Teuton, incited by world Jewry, is, if possible, or to survive, it should a renewed contest prove unavoidable. So what he's saying is that to Hitler, Germany's defeat in the Great War was due to losing the war of epic demographics. Mm-hmm. So Germany failed to provide prosperity for its excess population, resulting in millions of Germans emigrating around the world. And Germany had missed out on becoming a global power because it failed to keep these racially valuable people at home. So he looked at the historical migration waves, especially those who had left during the religious wars, and concluded that the Germans who emigrated were often the best racial stock. Like, these were the people who could survive a long trip to the Americas and find prosperity in a foreign land, mm-hmm. Starting from abject poverty.
Right.
Thus, the solution became Lebensraum in order to go through this racial healing process. And he didn't think of this theory. This was a geopolitical theory from the late 19th century by I think it was Friedrich Ratzel was the
German geographer.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, he had argued that living space for a nation was a biological requirement due to population pressures. And, this would, be adopted, Lebensraum would be adopted by German nationalists over the years by many high-ranking German officials. But with Hitler, there was like a added racial twist to it.
Yeah, of course. In the mid-1920s, when Hitler wrote Mein Kampf and later his secret second book, he spoke at length about the U.S. in like these very racial terms. And he said that there were tens of millions of Americans that were of German descent, and he called this a new folk community of racially highest value, which is wild. He believed that America had benefited from the immigration of Europe's quote unquote boldest and best, especially Nordic and German types. And, this emigration, he said, trained Europe and its strength while it helped America rise. And Hitler saw the U.S. as like this world empire that was emerging from this infusion of high quality European blood. Again, super speaking about it in very, very racist, ways, but he praised 1924 Immigration Act, in the United States, which set quotas that favored Northern Europeans, especially Germans. And to Hitler, that law confirmed that America saw itself as like a Nordic Germanic state, not a racial melting pot. And he wanted Germany to follow a similar path. He wanted to reject racial mixing and exclude Jews and other groups that he deemed inferior. Hitler and other Nazi leaders, they admired American eugenics programs and racial segregation laws. They thought this was great. They were taking notes. And historians had noted that the Nazis had studied U.S. restrictions on intermarriage and immigration as literal models for the things that they would propose later on. And the Nuremberg laws of 1935, which banned marriages between Jews and quote unquote Aryans, that was a direct inspiration from these American precedents, right? From these laws that they were literally taking notes on. And Hitler looked at America and, to a certain extent, the British Empire as these racial empires that should be emulated, right? He thought that Germany could do it too, and actually that he would be able to do it more thoroughly and more ideologically because, of course, master race, all that other bullshit that he spewed. But just like some context for it, right? This is to use a German word, it was the zeitgeist, right? This is, they were taking notes.
Well, I'll add at the same time, Hitler had contempt for German Americans. He had believed that they abandoned their heritage and their racial loyalty by assimilating into American society. Mm-hmm. There was a book by Jill Lepore. She quotes Hitler He said something. So a transplant a German to Kiev, and he remains a perfect German, but transplant him to Miami, and you make a degenerate out of him. In other words, an American, meaning that a German farmer in Eastern Europe could remain racially and culturally intact under German rule.
But as soon as you go to Miami, you just immediately become Florida man, right? It's a
Yeah.
pretty funny quote. Pretty funny quote, actually. Yeah, I mean, what you can assume that Hitler was, trying to bring German Americans back to the Reich, right? I imagine
I
he was
mean,
trying to pull some of them back.
by the 1930s, most German Americans were several generations removed and had no interest in returning. Plus, they didn't want to import people. Instead, they focused more on the ethnic German communities and mainly in Eastern Europe, but also in Latin America as well. Because the U.S. really didn't have a pro-Nazi movement. They had the German American Bund. They had people that they falsely claimed as Nazi sympathizers, like Charles Lindbergh.
Right.
But they didn't have, the Bund was not a huge political power or
Right.
a super sophisticated institution.
No.
They had 25,000 members,
Yeah.
and they had often embarrassed the Nazi regime. So they considered it a liability.
Yeah.
And German diplomats in the U.S. were under strict orders to not stir trouble with the American government. But I mean, going back to the kind of the claim that you put a German, and we can wrap this up after this. Going back to the claim that you put a German in Kiev and he remains German, but you put him in America and he turns American. Well, there's a good reason for that, because American society is better than fucking society in Kiev in the 20th century. It's a higher society. My family is from Kiev, so I have no problem saying that. They were ethnically cleansed out of Kiev.
Right.
But there was more of a high culture in America than there were in Eastern Europe. You had higher standards of living. You had more people who were educated. You had bigger economy. So they naturally were going to assimilate into that society because they didn't want to be their German communities could be close knit, but ultimately they would have to assimilate into the dominant Anglo culture to succeed in the long run. They couldn't just create these German enclaves forever. That would they couldn't just not assimilate at all, because how would they get further in society? All right. Well, thank you guys for listening to another episode of Bro History. We recorded another 50 or so minutes, and we decided that we could not put that on the podcast platform or YouTube platform because it would most likely be taken down in any second and our podcast would be flagged. So we're going to be put it on Substack. We went into controversial topics. So another reason to join our Substack. Also, you're probably, if you're listening, which the majority of our viewers listen to the show, you may have noticed that we were talking about a lot of visual cues, meaning that we have a YouTube channel, and that is where the video version of our podcast lives. Actually, we're video Spotify as well, but most of you guys listen on Apple anyway. It's like 10% of you guys listen on Spotify. The other 90% listen on Apple. So if you want to watch the podcast, and we plan on doing more visual stuff, go to the YouTube channel and subscribe to it. Anything else, Danny?
Yeah. I also just happen to like YouTube a little better because you can actually talk to us. We got into a lively debate on one of our shorts about whether or not race relations are better than ever. And let's just say it was a fun conversation in that comment section that we happen to pin to the top. So come join the conversation. We really enjoy it.
All right. Peace, guys. We will see you soon.
Peace.